Jarvis. I'm one of the New South Wales Business Relationship hosting this morning. We're going to take some time at the end for some questions. But in the meantime, we have some of our fantastic Plan Partners colleagues that have jumping in like absolute heroes, and they're going to take care of the chat function within Teams whilst we're kind of moving through. So please don't wait until the end. Pop any questions in there that you have. Rebecca, Milena and Bella are there to assist you. They're going to try and answer as many questions as possible as we're moving through. And then at the end, we'll have time and Becca's going to jump in and just ask any burning questions. But yeah, don't be shy. Get them in. So the acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past and present. For anyone that hasn't heard of Plan Partners, we're a national plan manager, and we have offices, as you can see from the little picture, all over Australia. We try to get into the community as much as possible and organise events and have that face-to-face connection. So we actually have relationship managers like myself that are in every state. We're the direct point of contact for any questions or any escalations that are needed, and we'll be sharing the details in case you don't have access to your closest BRM at the end. I'm just very briefly going to whip through some information around Plan Partners and some of our tools. If you're aware of our dashboard, you'll know that we spent 2 years taking feedback from the support coordinators and the providers that we work with in order to build it, to make it as user-friendly and to give as much time back into your day as we possibly can. It's colourful, it's easy to navigate, and we have not only a dashboard for participants and support coordinators, but also a provider portal. Our price guide navigator, if you think of this as your Google search for the whole of the NDIS price guide, so you simply type in a keyword, it scans the whole NDIS price guide, and it will give you exactly what category, what line item it can be funded under, which is really handy. And also our budget calculator, which allows you to work out what services you can access within NDIS plans and how much should be charged for each state. And the Knowledge Centre is, this has our up-to-date information on all of the latest NDIS changes that are happening within our industry, and you can find them all on our website. Now, I'm very excited to move to introduce our speakers. I just can't say enough kind words about these two. They've both been in the industry since the NDIA, before the NDIA began, and I have to say they are two of the most passionate and inspiring people that I've met in the industry since working in here. So we have Emmanuel Ginny, he is the National Operations Manager from Ability Connect, and Moira Prado, who is the Quality and Growth Manager for Golden Heart Services. Welcome. Good morning. Hi, Faye.
Good morning. Good afternoon. How is everyone?
Yeah, it's good afternoon. Sorry.
Thank you so much for that lovely welcome. And just so everybody knows, that photo of me is before I started working in the NDIS. So.
And I've got long hair now, so mine's slightly different as.
Oldie but a goldie.
Definitely.
Glow ups all round.
Thank you.
Fab. Well, thank you both for joining me. Obviously, as you know, just any conversations with you guys excites me. So very, very happy to have you both here. We'll get straight into it. Just a bit of a summary of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. And there's something that we've spoken about a lot together. and at our Penrith event also in person a couple of weeks ago. So we thought the fundamentals of the NDIS, it seems obvious, but really going back to basics, why the scheme was created and what it's supposed to do. Secondly, where to go when you're here now for invoices that are no longer being put through. There are so many options, opportunities. So really excited to run through them, and then excited to hear from you both. What does the future look like? So maybe we'll just get straight in there with what the NDIS was meant to do. Moara, do you want to kick us off and kind of go back to some of those basics?
Yeah, sure. So I like to start off with what NDIS is meant to do, because not a lot of people understand the purpose of having a national disability insurance scheme, and not everybody knows this. So if you hadn't been working in the disability sector before NDIS, you might not be aware that the funding bodies were actually decided as a state funding. So what that meant is, if you're a participant living in New South Wales and you wanted to move to WA, for example, it's not as simple as just packing up your things and moving. You actually had to know if your package would still be funded in the state of WA, and what did that look like, and what supports were available to you. So everything looked very different state by state. And we all know that moving has its own complexities and challenges, and especially if you're moving states, you don't know what the housing market is like, and then imagine we're adding an extra difficulty level with accessibility, and you don't know what community supports are there, you don't know what provider does what kind of support. So the purpose of the NDIS was to make sure that you could have one funding package that you were able to utilize anywhere in Australia. So if my participant wanted to pack up and move to Tasmania or Victoria or South Australia, they had the ability to do that with one less challenge. So then they'd be able to get there and say, hey, I've got this package, I just need to find the providers. That was the purpose of having one scheme for all.
And to add on, I guess, sorry, I jump in sometimes, it's my fault. But I think also one thing that we wanted to explain as well is, going into this, I know we're going to talk about where we're at in terms of the NDIS, where it's up to the gaps and so on. I think, to preface the conversation that we're about to have, I like to think about the fact that the scheme is relatively new considering its size. I think if we as organizations can think about the fact that if it was us who had to grow within the space of time that the NDIS has had to grow to, from 0 to 629,000 participants and growing, what would our systems look like? Would we have gaps? What would our recruitment look like? What would our staffing look like? And sometimes that can be challenging. Sometimes information that is shared or communicated is not always 100% on the same page across the board. So I do definitely share Mo's view. I think the NDIS, from our perspective as support coordinators anyway, was designed to build the community's capacity, or particular individuals' capacity, to exist in the world, not necessarily just solely focusing on NDIS or disability related supports, but also just for them to, depending on what their background is or what their situation is, to exist in just general human society. So that could look like something very different for different people. And I think when we were talking about this, this portion of it is to kind of set the framework for what we're going to be chatting about.
Exactly. And so Emmanuel and I, we bounce off each other, so we'll be going back and forward. But basically, if you think about Medicare and if you think about your private health cover, they allow you to use, this is the budget that you've got. You can go to specialists, you can go to GP. If you need to get glasses, you can choose to go Specsavers, or you can choose to go somewhere else. That's the fundamental of the NDIS in terms of being a national scheme. So why that's important is because we're trying to build a base, And that's going to lead us to all the changes and what the NDIS is trying to achieve. So it's important for us to understand, one, and I know this can be a trigger word, so choice and control, and why that's important. So beforehand, everyone was stuck in their state, or there was a lot of challenges and barriers in order to move to different states because everyone's funding was different. And so now we have a national scheme and you're able to utilize that package anywhere in Australia. So that was one thing. Amanda, do you want to take the second one, or do you want to add anything to that?
So I want to add, like, I mean, ultimately speaking, the NDIS, the NDIS is a funding package for an individual. And I think one thing that we both share on this topic is it's about understanding the human being. So yes, there is a particular set of funding that is available for the individual, but it's about understanding the human and the goals that they want to achieve. And that's a common theme that will be consistent across what we talk about this whole time. So yes, there's a lot of changes. Yes, there's a lot of things happening, and yes, there's gaps. But fundamentally, it's about understanding the individual, where they want to go, and utilizing the funding that has been provided. And not always is it, you know, perfect that the funding's been provided. I understand, but utilizing that funding to assist that person to reach those particular goals. Now, it seems basic, right? We all know that it seems basic. It seems simple, but sometimes we forget you know, those simple concepts when we're trying to support people within this space. So from our perspective, you know, the funding that's provided is used to assist that individual to achieve those particular goals, interact with society. You know, it doesn't always have to be NDIS related, and, you know, supports. It could be mainstream supports and so on, and as we'll talk about in a minute as well.
Yeah. The second thing that's very important and sometimes not common knowledge is the NDIS was never and will never be for every single person with a disability or a diagnosis. So it's really important to understand that the scheme was not funded to support every single person that has a disability. So I have a lot of participants and friends who have been trying to get access to the scheme for a really long time, and often that frustration builds, and then there's a lot of misinformation about the scheme not working. But the truth is the scheme was never for them. We have 629,000 people in the scheme at the moment trying to access it, and a lot more that are not part of the scheme. So what I like to say in my presentations is we are one, but we are many, right? And from all Australia we come. So we have to understand that that pocket of money has to service every single individual in the scheme and in the people that are out to come. So I understand, and by no means am I defending the NDIA, because I think that they make a lot of decisions that are wrong, and we do need to fight against that. And we will talk a little bit about what that means when we come to our next part of the presentation. But in order to minimize the risk of having that frustration and having that misinformation that the scheme doesn't work, we need to know what was the scheme built for in the first place. Who are the people that are eligible to access the scheme? And the truth is, not everybody. There's a lot of other components, a lot of mainstream, a lot of community, a lot of other departments like Centrelink, like Medicare, that are there to support those individuals who are not eligible for the scheme. The truth is, NDIS is designed for people who are in the pointy end, people that cannot survive without supports.
Yeah, definitely. And I think from a common theme, and I think obviously we've established, you know, originally what the NDIS scheme was designed for. And I think the one thing that I have found over my time, you know, support coordination, trying to learn as much as I can and simply obsessed with the space, is I think we forget that, you know, once someone is funded, there is a purpose for their funding. It's not just funding for the sake of funding. And sometimes the idea from the NDIS, remembering that it's ideally aimed to build an individual's capacity or build a service system around that person for them to be able to achieve those goals. So often speaking is utilizing that funding strategically in order to achieve that goal. Now that goal may not necessarily be, obviously is going to be different depending on the person you speak to, but or their particular situation. But often I find when we're working with participants and or people, you know, our job, especially as support coordinators, is to educate the individual to eventually navigate the world on their own. You know, whether it be through assistive technology, for example, you know, maybe that person just needs those particular services set around them so that they can navigate the world on their own and know where to go, what to do, you know, or for example, in some cases, and obviously more risky cases, so setting up a risk management system around them, setting up that service provider around them. I mean, it's obviously going to look different for depending on the individual, but fundamentally, it's a funding body that was obviously aimed to, or funding that's provided to the participant in order for them to interact with the outside world, whether it's through mainstream services, NDIS funded services, building that person's ability, that skill, that capacity, setting the world around them, you know, available. Ultimately speaking, regardless of what strategy you look at, you know, whether it's SDA, short-term accommodation, whatever it may be, therapies, that's what it was designed for people to interact with the world as independently as they possibly can, given their situation.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think this is why NDIA rely on how much family support do they have, how much are they engaged in the community, and yes, they do have goals, but what is the capacity of that individual to achieve that goals? Because we know that we want the best for our participants. We want them to achieve absolutely every single goal, but sometimes it's outside of the scope of their capacity, and sometimes it's not something that they're interested in. So is it unfair to ask family and friends to be informal supports of participants? Sometimes, and sometimes, you know, they are burnt out, and NDIS has places for that, as well as other mainstream and community supports, which we'll talk about. But the point is, if your participant has a mum, a dad, a brother, a sister, or some sort of informal supports, we have to remember that there are participants that have nobody, that have no one. So we do have to rely a little bit, or what's expected of the informal supports. NDIS doesn't have money at the moment. I wish that we did. I wish we had more funding, and obviously there are gaps. But we have to work with the budget that we have. And that means that when you're looking at your participant, you also have to be looking at the other 629,000 participants in the scheme. So that's what a planner does. A planner looks at your participant, and sometimes, yes, they can be cutthroat and be like, you don't need this, you don't need that. But really what they're trying to say is there are other people out there who are less advantage of your participants. So how are we best using all the supports available outside of the scheme to allow people that don't have access to those supports to use this funding?
It's seen as a tool, right? Like a tool to support the individual rather than the something like a crutch you depend on, if that makes sense. It's used as a tool, and I mean that obviously you can use that in contextually, like if you're talking about someone with high complex needs. I'm saying that the funding is a tool to allow that person to live as independently and safely as possible. It's not something that is essentially a crutch. It's used, okay, we've got this funding, how are we going to use it to support this person to achieve, you know, whatever their goal may be, a normal life, or for, you know, or it could be, you know, I work with participants that I walk into their house, they're new amputee, and their number one goal is I want to be able to walk outside my door by myself. And you know, using that funding to that effect.
Yeah,
I feel like that's naturally moving us over to, you know, what the NDIS is actually doing currently.
Yes.
Go.
So yeah, so I mean, I think we all know, and we're all probably aware of a lot of the discussions around changes, the legislation, and so on. I think for us, as support coordinators, I mean, the way we've operated has always been kind of what we've discussed. We can see that some of the changes that have been happening have made it a little bit easier for the NDIS to turn around and say no. Which is somewhat understandable, I guess, for us and for me. And I'm not sure, Mo, if you agree, but I think the idea that there should be particular creative solutions being attempted instead of relying solely on just, you know, for example, one-to-one supports in every situation, or, you know, the idea that there should be some solutions or new creative ideas explored is what I see, what is, you know, trying to be happening at the moment.
I think the word individualized support has actually come to mean that everyone's working on their own. And, you know, we've got support coordinators, we've got support workers, we've got plan managers, and everyone is an independent body group. So we're forgetting to actually work as a team. So what the individualized support should actually say is individualized package, but we're still working as a team. So what has been happening, exactly as Emmanuel said, everyone's fighting so hard for that one participant to just get one-to-one to get, but actually, if we're really looking, is the support making a difference? Is the OT report actually making a difference? Are you asking the OT to actually come back and implement those recommendations? What difference are you making in your participant's life? Because the funding, if it's not working, then what's the point of having it? If we're looking at the reason for NDIS transitioning mental health out of the scheme, at least a couple of the reports that I read and some of my personal experience with my participants, I had a participant who, before NDIS, she had 2 hours of support and she was going to TAFE, she was doing her own shopping, she had no issues with her hygiene, and then NDIS came along, she got a $100,000 package, and suddenly she had support for 4 or 5 hours a week, every single day, and she stopped going to TAFE, she stopped with her hygiene care, she stopped doing her shopping, and she actually regressed because she had an overwhelming amount of support and she didn't know what to do with that. So before we're fighting for all these things that we think is best for our participants, we need to take a step back and we need to have a trauma-informed approach. We need to understand, is this what the participant wants? And also, what is their capacity of having all the support? What does that mean in their life? And are we actually taking that independence away from them? And I know that this is not a business model that then goes on to support SIL and ILO and SDN and everything. And trust me, I work in SIL, so I'm the first one to understand that this is not a money-making scheme. And I think that's where the gap, where NDIS generated hundreds and thousands of jobs, but actually the revenue still remains the same. The purpose of NDIS is to make ourselves redundant. They don't want to see participants being more reliant on the scheme. As a planner, my former life, we had to justify how our supports were going to assist participants to become more independent. But in reality, are we actually doing that? In reality, are we asking for all these supports? Why? So we can sustain a business, or so we can actually make a difference in the individual's life? So this is where I ask for a lot of providers to actually sit down and have a think about, did I get into this business to make a lot of money? Because if you did, you should really consider what that looks, the impact that it has in the participants that you're supporting, because NDIS wants to see improvements, and they want to see that you actually understand your participant, you understand that they need to be connected with other individuals, that they need to be connected with other bodies as outside of the NDIS.
It's the human approach, isn't it? It's the idea that you're working with a human being that has aspirations, goals. They want to live, you know, as per their particular choices. And you're 100% correct. And I think in our experience, often you find that lack of collaboration and that lack of understanding for the individual you're supporting. I'm not saying it's across the board, like everywhere. We are lucky enough to work with some amazing providers. Just to as an example, you know, I know there's a particular client that we're, you know, trying to mutually support them, but the one thing we're talking about is what are they wanting for their lives in the future? That was the first point of conversation. What are they actually wanting to achieve? This, you know, this particular individual wants some independence in the future, to be safe, to explore life for themselves. And then I guess the important question is, how do we get there? You know, then that's about having a collaborative discussion with you know, providers about, you know, what options and what solutions and what can we be doing, or even the idea of discussing transitional plans. So it's not as simple as saying, you know, what's the plan for the future? Are we just throwing money at this person, or are we aiming, what is the actual plan to get them to those goals? And often what was happening more previously to the 3rd of October that we're seeing is more the NDIS didn't have as much ability to force the question to people, to say, hang on, what do you actually what are you actually doing here? What's the plan here? What are we actually trying to achieve? Yes, I understand that the OT is recommending, 24/7 one-to-one because there's risk, but what's the plan after that? Well, is that going to be forever? If so, why? Or are we working towards a more social dynamic? How are they going to interact with the world and so on? Sorry, I rant, but I know we've got different topics to go through.
We love the rant. We love the rant, but I think there's never enough time to get everything that you guys have to say. I love it. And I think it's that aspect of working as a team and providers all working together, and just sharing knowledge, which kind of, I guess, pulls us now into the next topic that we're really keen to talk about, which is where to go when you're told no.
Yeah.
Things are, and obviously I want to kick off with yourself really in this, Emmanuel, but things are changing. Where do we go? What are the other options, and what can we kind of take out of today? And
so I'm going to talk about a particular experience, and I'll be brief because I know Mo's got a lot of amazing resources in this space as well, separate to the NDIS. But as a support coordinator, I'm going to talk about some of the experiences we have when the NDIS is coming back to you and saying no, essentially. So what we wanted to go through is when the no is appropriate and when the no isn't. So some cases, naturally, the NDIS have to, well, not have to, but are saying no for a particular reason. So, as an example, I'm currently working with a particular family that are having some severe challenges. There's a major lack of home modifications. There's a major lack of supports available for them. Now, in this particular case, we've been able to establish the fact that and not enough evidence was provided. Now, as an example, it's about understanding the position of the individual, where they are up to in the process, and trying to determine whether or not we are going to pursue the next stages, which for anyone who doesn't know, obviously you're talking about change of situations, potentially review of reviewable decisions, and then potentially up to the ART process. Now, in this particular individual's case, not enough one-to-one support evidence was provided, so the NDIS weren't able to justify the specific needs for the individual. There was no information presented to them in relation to why the major home modifications were required and what was it meant to do? What was the long-term plan? Was this person going to stay in this house forever? Were they going to be moving into a different space? And really trying to hone in on the idea of providing them with a transitional solution, or providing them with some evidence to be able to go, hang on, this is why, this is the plan. We're not just thinking about this in the immediate term, we're also thinking about this in the long term. Yeah. Mo, did you want to add on to that one?
I was just going to add that there's a difference between ideal and realistic. And I think that when you don't understand the fundamentals of the scheme, you're constantly getting told no because you're expecting ideal. But the truth is we live in the realistic. So NDIS is not going to fund everything for everyone all the time. And what we should be working towards is not making a participant a full-time NDIS participant where they're constantly having to find OTs and reports and redo this and go through reviews. We should equip ourselves enough with information and with knowledge and understanding of where the fundamentals of the scheme to know this is appropriate. We have a shot doing exactly what Emmanuel has said. Understand, okay, well, I can see that the home modifications were actually appropriate for what and best funded through the NDIS. So why didn't they get through? Then see through that. But if the participant is asking for something that was never going to be funded by the NDIS in the first place, this is where we have to look elsewhere. It's not that you can't help them or there's no help for them, but NDIS is not the place to go. So let's minimize that frustration and let's put all of our energy into finding the right resources for those people instead of creating more anxiety and creating more misinformation over the scheme.
I think it goes back to that idea of understanding the human you're working with and what they're trying to achieve, and then discussing collaboratively with the other individuals around them in relation to strategies. As an example, we had a participant that we were supporting who in the first year had 66 incident reports, all with multiple incidences within. So this was just 66 different days. And we worked with the provider, identified, what the aim was for this individual, worked with them, because at the time it was 24/7 1-to-1. And I guess this person now, through collaboration, and at times we identified that there were providers that weren't equipped, not to any, they were doing an amazing job. We just needed specifically specialized individuals to assist this human being, in order to achieve the next steps. Now that just goes with anyone, like, even with us as support coordinators, if we're not the right fit, we're not the right fit. If we need a specific skill set, you need a specific skill set. And I guess it's about being honest in that space. But for this particular participant, we collaboratively discussed with the providers, to work through strategies, decide whether or not, decisions were being made appropriately, because sometimes, those sort of questions need to be asked. And we work through now that point where he's at periods of his day where he doesn't have supports. Now, that was done through collaborative approach with the clinical psychologist, with the behavior support practitioner, with the OT, with the support provider. And it was about almost daily conversations about what is actually going wrong here. Who, could it be the approach, the language? What's the framework we need to be working within, so that we can move past this idea of just throw 24/7 supports because he's consistently getting into particular risky situations.
But just quickly going back to what happens when you're told no and it's an actual no, the first thing you should do is a Google search, a quick Google search. If your participant, for example, I have a friend who just reached out to me and she's really struggling with her epilepsy. She's constantly having seizures and she wanted to know if she could apply for the NDIS. Now, I know that the odds of her getting an application form with just epilepsy and being a full-time mum with a partner who actually works, who's got this whole informal support around her is very slim. So instead of saying, yeah, cool, I'm going to help you apply, I literally just went to Google and I typed in free epilepsy support, and then I have a wealth full of knowledge of all these free resources and free things that she could actually call in and apply. And I was like, hey, let's look at Centrelink. Let's look at everything else. And she was like, oh my God, thank you so much. So now she's got an appointment with the National Epilepsy Support Services. And there was no frustration. She didn't think, oh my God, I've spent $2,000 in a functional capacity assessment that I'm never going to use again. And I was told no by the NDIS, and now my seizures are increasing because I've got more stress. It was like, I don't think NDIS is the best support for you. Let's look elsewhere. Along with that, Beth is going to send out a list of all the free resources, like not all of them, but a few of them. And that just includes, we've got free support for carers through Carer Gateway. If you haven't heard from them, if you haven't heard of them, they're incredible. They give free holidays to carers. They take them up to the Harbour Bridge. Like, they're just amazing people. It's a not-for-profit. They're incredible, very underutilized. We've got free advocacy services as well. There is a free recreational program called RecLink, which allows participants to have free dancing, Zumba, yoga, painting, just absolutely everything that you can imagine. It's made to help fight isolation in young children and adults. So there's just so much out there. There's so many grants as well that people can apply for. Young Carers Australia was giving $5,000 to $10,000 for people to buy equipment or house modifications that wasn't approved by the NDIS. There's a lot of mental health supports as well for things outside of the scheme. So honestly, all it takes is a Google search. Perhaps even use ChatGPT. I've never done it, but I've just thought about it now, and
highly recommend
to do the research for you. But the truth is, before you help your participant to fight a fight that's just going to create frustration, anxiety, and go and use Google and see what else you can find. You're going to be amazed, especially state by state. I'm a big advocate for WA because I just spent the last 6 years there. And my God, they have so much. And then now that I'm in Sydney, I'm looking up all these, and there's just so much more, and there's just like all these little things in different, because we're a very populated city, there's just all these incredible people doing amazing work that no one knows about, because all we're focused on is getting every penny from the NDIS, when actually you could be helping your participant elsewhere.
And even council websites as well, you've mentioned before, May.
Oh yeah, if you go into your council, that's the easiest thing to do. For example, St. George Council, literally St. George Council events, and you will have a theme of events in the libraries everywhere in that council for free. So like Coffee Connects, chess, board games, they have memory, they have just so much, and it's just amazing. And the people that run it, and they're all volunteers, and they just really want the best for the community. And again, not a lot of people attend because they're just so focused on fighting to get things funded that really you could be making a difference out there. There's community gardens, there's origami, there's just everything you can think of.
And to add some extra weight to what Mo's saying, it's I think I'm assuming there's some support coordinators involved or listening as well. You know, when you're approaching, let's just say, a complex participant with you know, and the NDIS is consistently coming back to you to say no, often what we find is that they are wanting to see the information and evidence of what other options you've tried. So, you know, it also adds extra value to go out and just seek other options through the mainstream services or different creative options. Because ultimately speaking, when you go back to the NDIS and say, hang on, look at all the stuff we've tried, like, what would you like us to do now? It is another way to determine where you actually sit in the process. As a quick example, I recently walked into a particular family's home. The parents are about 80 or so years old, and they've got a son that's living with them, and they're really worried about the future. Now, they want to sell their house, and because they can't afford it. So we were discussing options. Our first conversation wasn't SIL. Our conversation that we ended up on was, well, why don't we look at, you know, retirement village homes where they can live together, because the son is about over 55, and we're looking for options to implement supports in a retirement village where he's sustainable. He's got a long-term option, housing option. He doesn't necessarily need SIL, and you build in supports. And then we're talking about mainstream services around him, social groups. You know, he can get involved in the activities at the particular village, and, you know, really support him in an environment that's not solely reliant on the agency.
100%. And just on that as well, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to participants and said, you know, do you want to try this board games evening, or do you want to try this coffee catch up? And they're like, I don't want anything that's NDIS specific. And I'm like, well, this isn't. How about you just come in and have a go? And also Meetup, MEET, up, like Meetup. So many incredible groups that meet in public places about every single topic you can think of. Like any topic, you just type in, and the purpose of that is to have like-minded individuals come together and create friendship groups. Also an incredible resource. The libraries also help with job searches. So they do resume writing, they do practice of one-on-one, and they sit down and do job searches, all for free. So instead of, again, going back to NDIS, and again, this goes by your participant's capacity, so it's not for everybody. But if you've got a participant who you think, yes, you do have the capacity, we're going to have to go back, do a review, get job seeking, put into your resume, and then have to go find an employment provider, go to the library first. Go and have a one-on-one. These people are so excited to sit down and build your resume with you. And you know what? You're also getting them into the community, into a mainstream open environment where they're having communication and interaction with someone who's not looking at them as disability specific, someone who's like, cool, okay, let's do this. Use that.
I love it. I'm definitely going to share in the follow-up email a list with as many of those things as we can include, but there were so many that I'd never heard of previously. And then after my first sit down and chat with you both, I went away and I Googled, and yeah, it's crazy what you can find with just that bit of knowledge or knowing where to start, I think is really handy. So thank you. There's some really great insights. Moving on, I think, for our last sort of topic, and then we'll jump into some questions. But I think it's great to look at, you know, we've gone through the fundamentals, why the scheme was created. We've gone through where it's pivoting to and what you can kind of do and where you can find new opportunities and resources and supports for your participants. But would really interested in hearing from you both. Where do you think the scheme is headed? What does the potential look like? What does the next 6 months to 6 years, sort of, where are we headed? Manuel, do you want to kick us off? I know that obviously from a very tech perspective, you've got some great insights on this.
Yeah, look, I have a particularly positive view. I will preface to say that I'm aware of the particular gaps and challenges that are being faced. I'm a little hopeful of the future, to be honest. I think the one thing, sharing a particular experience, when I first started as support coordinator, I was managing, my portfolio. I did not have access to their plans. I did not have access to see what their funding looked like. I couldn't see what was happening. The wait times were incredible. I think going forward, the future for us, with some of the changes, and I won't go into all of the details around the legislation, but it's bringing us back to that original idea that the scheme was designed to support someone to build their capacity and really make an actual difference and impact on their lives. And I think the standards are slowly starting to increase to that effect, with all the different changes around registrations and so on. And the one thing that we want to maintain is the ability for participants to have an abundance of options, because I think without an abundance of options, that standard then comes back down. So whilst registration and standards for supporting vulnerable people are important, those options are still there. So for me, with PACE, in particular, I think I see a lot of opportunity for quicker actioning of different situations. Whilst it hasn't happened yet, I'm really hopeful that going forward, the NDIS would have a clearer understanding of where things are going wrong specifically. So if we talk about the idea that they have better insights to understand where in the funding specifically is the issue. So for example, is it core supports? Is it the allied health supports? And really having a stronger and deeper understanding of what is the actual issue for the individual, not just saying, oh, we've run out of funding. Well, no, why have we run out of funding? And what are we doing about it? Is it just, is it actual need, or is it something that we need to be, something that we need to be addressing through better strategy or better training or so on?
Yeah, and I think if we're looking at, if you imagine that you build a team and you've given them a lot of autonomy and said, this is the goal, and you've just achieved it. Not everyone works well in the scheme, in a scheme like that. So now they're pulling it back and they're giving it structure. So the fundamentals haven't changed. We still need to achieve what we need to achieve, but now we're putting a lot more structure. So if you think about during COVID, how every single person got approved for an iPad and an iWatch and an iPhone. But it's like, do they really need that? Was that the best equipment that they could have for the purpose of what they were asking the equipment for? No. So then now it's really hard to get that approved. Not that the NDIS is saying you can't have a communication device, but prove to us that that's the best communication device. And I know we're short on time, but this is just a quick example. When I worked with the CATS team in WA, which is a very niche group of incredible people who create technology that doesn't exist yet for very unique individuals with a disability, they got me in to say, please stop funding iPads or stop letting support coordinators and plan managers approve iPads, because one, they're more expensive, and two, the tablets that we actually need are $200, $250, and they are way better to speak to our programs than Apple. Apple's only compatible with Apple. So can you please get that knowledge out to them? So it's not always because the product's more expensive that's actually better for your participants. So what the NDIS is trying to do now is trying to bring that in. And just lastly, on PACE, it hasn't happened yet, but the purpose of the PACE also was to divide the funding into quarters, because a lot of participants were either overwhelmed or I guess too much choices or not enough choices, or that whole mental health digression thing that I spoke about, where they weren't using their plan for 2-3 years, and then suddenly a provider was coming in and using $300K in a couple of months of that whole 3-year plan. The purpose of dispensing a plan in quarters was we could help the individuals to say, well, we have to use it this quarter. We could help providers to be more proactive, also with invoicing, because a lot of providers don't invoice for ages and they invoice all at once, and that's a good I guess, a good continuous improvement inside your own organization, if that's you. And then if you didn't use that funding, why didn't you? What can we do to support you to do that? But if you did overuse that funding, do we then take the funding from the next quarter into this? NDIS wants to know why. They want to be more proactive. They want to be more involved. Of course, they're very behind. They have recruited, I think, over, I don't know how many people that they're going through all the training. So there are gaps, but if you learn to understand the fundamentals of why the scheme is created, not for everyone, there are other things that we can use out there, then your frustration and the frustration of who you're working with and your participants actually is going to decrease, and you're actually going to start making changes in that individual's life.
I know, again, just some quick, for me, some quick, more, I guess, slightly more controversial, things that may or may not be happening in the future that I guess some of us may want answers to. The key questions that I think about when talking about the future, yes, obviously we're hopeful for the future, but there are a few key things that I think need to be answered, and we don't know the answers yet. For me, going forward is I understand the NDIS is building out teams. They're building out, more specialized individuals to help with certain diagnosis so that they have more clear and accurate information. We've talked about all these, this overarching functional assessment that they're going to create for people. What does that look like? Who's designing that? Is it who's it favoring? We understand that through the independent assessment that happened quite some time ago, that they want everyone entering the scheme, or people potentially looking to join the scheme, to have access to someone to help them navigate the space, whether that be through to mainstream supports or NDIS funded supports or whatever that case may be. I guess the fundamental question I have is looking at the future and saying, okay, well, with this, specifically talking about the navigation space, because that's quite a, space for that obviously we're a part of, is with all of the idea of not forcing, but trying to get providers and participants on the same page of thinking creatively and so on. Where does the relationship lie with this navigation role? Is it with the agency, or is it with participants directly? Because going forward, that really changes how we approach it. Now, there is no answer at the moment, to be clear, but it really does change, because the difference between where the relationships lie could change the model completely. So some of the things that we've been talking about may not necessarily be possible depending on the relationship. So again, it's about, some of the futures. I'm hopeful that they're spending actual time to develop a model, which I really like, with all the programs and grants they're trying to put in place. So, but those couple fundamental questions for me are things that I'm eager to continue to see and help. And if the NDIS want to talk to me, I'm here. I'm happy to chat.
And just lastly, just quickly talking about the current changes, there isn't all they're doing is just creating that structure. So the difference between a diagnosis and a functional impairment is that beforehand, everybody was linking every request for funding into that diagnosis. My participant needs noise cancelling headphones because of their primary diagnosis of autism, but it's not every single person with a diagnosis of autism needs noise cancelling headphones. So what impairment, what is it stopping them from doing that they need that headphone? So really, we're just creating that structure around to ensure that we're maximizing results with the funding that we're providing and minimizing fraud. Same with, as of October 3rd, you will not be back paid for any supports that weren't funded in the first place. Whereas before, you could go and do the manual payment, where now NDIS is saying, if we didn't approve this, you should have a contingency plan. You shouldn't be just keep providing supports over supports, because a lot of people, unfortunately, were fraudulent. So even though that's impacting a lot of providers that are doing the right thing, we do need to just do the right thing. And, we are going to have have some contingency plans, unfortunately, where reviews take longer than expected, and we have to take participants to hospital and all those things that go against the trauma-informed model that we're trying to implement. But the truth is that stops people from being fraudulent and spending millions. And, sometimes even, I think that guy came out and he's like $10 million he's told from the NDIS. I was reading about it yesterday. So I am hopeful that that's going to stop the people that are doing the wrong thing and allowing us who are doing the right thing to expand into the structure that NDIS is creating for us.
It's such a large topic. I think we could go on about it for hours, and I'm sure we haven't answered everything because there's a lot more changes that we could talk about, and we have talked about for literally 3-4 hours at a time every time we sit down. But is this the question time? If anyone has,
Yeah, I think really moving well. Thank you both so much. I could sit and listen to you for hours and hours. But yeah, I think really, really good timing back. Is there anything that's come up that you think would be great question to share?
Yeah, well, there's actually not a lot throughout the webinar itself. Firstly, I just wanted to highlight that there were a couple of people at the start of the webinar that were unable to see the presentation. So just letting you know that you will receive a recording, but as you would have seen, we really just spoke through the different topics so that you weren't really missing anything from the presentation side of things. And Philip has just dropped a question in the chat saying, what is happening in regards to SC approval in new participants' plans? Lately, most planning meetings have had the planner not fund SC, and we're being told that the LAC will help the SC. So I know that none of us are from the NDIA ourselves, but we see this current trend as well. But you guys might want to enlighten us as to what you're seeing as well when it comes to SC approval.
So I think the key thing there was LAC for me. I think technically speaking, I think for the longest time, when there is an LAC, in some cases, it can be considered a duplication of supports. We understand the reality of the LAC programs and their capacity to actually provide the supports that are being suggested. But realistically speaking, around that situation, I guess it depends on the participant situation. So for me, it is always about complexity, and I know it's not a direct answer, but in simple, for lack of a better word, more, simpler situations, we are seeing that they're pointing back towards the LAC program. But in more complicated situations, for example, I've got participants where they've funded over 100 hours and there is an LAC involved, but that's because this particular individual had a really complicated and complex need. So from our perspective, it is definitely contextual. And I guess depending on what they do with the LAC program going forward as well, will also change that.
Also, just to add to that, NDIA uses streaming levels. So depending on how much support your participant requires, they were actually never supposed to be funded a support coordinator in the first place. That responsibility should have been left with the LAC. But then again, not enough LACs, not enough competence in the offices and things. So then they were funding SCs for a short term. And now the role of the LAC is to make themselves redundant to a certain point. Obviously, a lot of complexities do need a certain level of support throughout their life. It's not perfect, but in that situation, I would look back as has the support coordinator been providing all the reports? Have they been actually making a difference and using the hours correctly to support the participant? And if so, then they've done their job, which means they're actually the participants quite well set up and that the LAC should be able to take on. Or was there a gap where that participant will need more specialized SC, in which case then you could go back and ask for a review and then put in the documentation of what the SC has been doing that the LAC won't be able to do.
And I think another solution as well, if your participant is has a psychosocial diagnosis, maybe a request psychosocial recovery coaching versus support coordination. It's not seen as a duplication necessarily because it's a very different model. And again, it definitely goes back to the complexity of the individual. I mean, we all know, and I think I've seen a question pop up regarding LACs and whether or not what happens when they're not contactable. I didn't receive the whole question, but I mean, it's not an uncommon thing that occurs. Again, my answer is risk. What is the risk to the participant situation? And then if there is a lack of action, you have, which we have at times used the local MP to escalate a request to see what the, particular reason is why a support coordinator needs to be involved versus an LAC. Because obviously an LAC is very basic connections. It's not as that more case management model. So yeah, there's a number of options. Again, you could talk about it contextually. If anyone has any particular, situations they needed to talk through, I'm happy to do it as well.
Yeah, and I guess my answer is a little bit more aggressive. I would go directly to the LAC office and I'll sit there with my participant or encourage the participant with their family or some sort of advocate or some sort of allied health to go to the office and say, I need to speak to someone right now. And I know that that's not in the realm of possibility of everybody, but you are more likely to get a response and some support directly if you show up to the LAC office, and every LAC has a catchment area, so you should not have an LAC with outside of your catchment area, so everything should be accessible to your participants.
We've also done the same thing with the local NDIS office as well, if we're not comfortable. So the local NDIS office obviously has gotten involved in certain circumstances to be able to push a result through, and that's where we've gotten access to a manager or someone who can say, hang on a second, and make a quicker decision as well.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Got one last really quick question that we can get through. So this was from Verity. How do we get pre-approval for a service to ensure participants won't be asked, I'm assuming, to pay the money back? And can we get an NDIS delegate to approve something specific during the lifetime of a plan when the funding is already available but support services in a grey area? So that's probably more of a plan management question. Beth, if you want to go ahead and answer that, or would you like me to?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in relation to having anything pre-approved, it's always best to have something in writing. If it is in a grey area where a plan manager might be pushing back, you want to get that in writing from an NDIA delegate for sure. Otherwise, what you can do, and from a plan partner's perspective, you can actually just send through that information. If we've got that mutual participant and we can see the plan, we'll have a look, and our teams will be able to identify whether we can comfortably say, yes, that service is available, the funding is there, and we can give that limiting pre-approval, keeping in mind that any plan manager that pre-approves any type of invoice, it is always up to the NDIA really for that final approval. So we can just, from our experience and on the basis of what that invoice is, give that insight into saying, yes, we feel very comfortable in putting this through to the NDIA. So Verity, I hope that answered your question. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to Beth or any of the plan partners team, and we can talk through something more specific with you then. But Beth,
I'll just quickly add, sorry. If you get your participant to sign the consent form to share information, and then you can email the provider support email address, which is pretty responsive. So instead of having to wait to find a delegate and go directly through that, and we all know that 1-800 number has a lot of different responses. If you have the consent for your participant and then you email that specific scenario to the provider support line, they will get back to you in writing with, yes, this is approved, no, this is not approved, and then you can send that directly to the plan manager.
Thank you.
We also have a My Supports tool as well. So it's a list of questions that you can answer on our website, and that helps to establish the reasonable necessary for the item or service that you're looking at partaking in. You can also get some quotes as well. So you can get a quote for a service, submit that into our admin team and just say, hey team, can you let me know if this would be approved or not? So that way you're not telling your participant 100% can and getting the invoice. You can send the quote. Otherwise, again, we've got that My Supports tool, which will just ask you the list of questions, which will then identify the reasonable or necessary, which will help a plan manager also make a decision when it comes to that kind of grey area if nothing's been definitely highlighted.
I promise you last thing. I'm sorry, everyone. But to add to, and I'm sure plan partners would appreciate if any support coordinators out there, explain the risks, get the evidence, communicate that through to the plan manager so their understanding of what's going on. Because in some cases, some of these pre-approvals are surrounding increasing supports because a change has happened or something's happened. And I think you know, can appreciate that plan partners are held accountable for their decisions, same as I'm held accountable for mine. So it's about us as a collective communicating effectively to each other about what's happening and why. And in some cases it can't happen, for more black and white situations, but for those greys, get the evidence. Is it a hospital or a doctor or a GP that's saying, hang on, something needs to happen here, or a psychologist or a clinical or a behavior practitioner? Just communicate what that need is and why it's needed as well. That was my 2 cents.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
It was a great 2 cents and a great finishing line. I will be sharing, as I mentioned already, an email afterwards with all of the details that we've sort of discussed, with all of the links that we've discussed with, and I think the lovely Bella's just put in some details and some contact details, for our internal teams, but I'll also pop that in. And then, yeah, please reach out. This is trying very hard to cram a lot of information and a lot of wealth of knowledge into 1 hour, but let this be the start of conversations. Get in touch with myself, get in touch with Marara, get in touch with Emmanuel. Let's carry on sharing knowledge, keeping those conversations happening and those doors open. But thank you both so much once again. You are amazing and I really appreciate you, and until the next time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And if anyone ever needs a resource and you can't find it, just reach out to me, because I am very invested in finding free resources in the community, and I love finding out about new and researching it. So feel free to contact me and we can have a chat, even if you're not in New South Wales, especially if you're in WA, because I do have a very big amount of resources there. But thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Appreciate it. Though, thank you again. Thank you, Plan Partners. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.